set up because I know there's usually a little pause.
You're good.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm so happy to be here today to talk about the Agriculture Museum. My name's Anne Graumlich, and I'm the curator at the Museum of Ventura County Agriculture Museum, and I have been there since we created it and we opened in September of 2011. So we're now 2 years old, and we spent the previous 6 months before we opened preparing this wonderful space. And of course, I prepared a PowerPoint, but since we don't have a laptop, I'll just have to describe all those great images and do my best to tell you the history without that. The idea of the Agriculture Museum actually goes back many decades. And it started with one person, and we have more information about him at the Agriculture Museum. His name is Bob Filer. And Bob Filer was a fourth generation Oxnard farmer. He was born in 1908 and he lived to 2002. And he lived on the same piece of land that his great grandparents had purchased in 1868. And he had quite a feeling for this approximately 100 acres in Oxnard, very close to the corner of today's current Gonzales Road and Oxnard Boulevard. And he was a farmer his whole life. What that means is when he was a young boy, he helped his father, and the day after he graduated from high school, he started farming full-time. And that's all he wanted to do, and he loved it. And the wonderful thing is, he took a lot of pictures during his life of farming, and those have come to the museum and are coming gradually from his children. He had 4 children himself. And so that's quite helpful, because when you think about farming 1 or 2 generations or 3 generations or 4 generations ago, it really is helpful to have a picture, because farming changes so dramatically every decade or 2 or 3 that if we didn't have pictures, it would be very hard to know exactly how they did all those different things that they no longer do today. So Bob Filer was an active farmer, and he also was very interested in his community, and he loved Oxnard. And as he got to be an older man, he became active in the Ventura County Society of Pioneers, I believe they used to call themselves, a historical society, and he was the president of that back in the 1960s. And then, as he got to be older and probably had a little bit more time, and his kids were a little older, and he decided that he was going to start collecting farm implements. And when I say farm implements, I'm talking about tractors and thrashers and big pieces of equipment. And the reason he decided to do this is because he could see that agriculture had changed in his lifetime. He was an active farmer from the 20s through the 70s approximately, or the 30s through the 80s, about that period. But he remembered his dad talking, and probably his grandfather talking about how they used to do things. And he was interested, and he also knew that farmers tend to keep things around. You know, after they stop farming this crop and they move to this crop, they still have the equipment they used to have, and sometimes they maybe modify it and keep using it, and sometimes they just throw it out in the back of the farm somewhere in a gully, and it sits there for decades. And young people like Bob Filer wonder what it is, I suppose, when they ask about it. So Bob Filer was interested in the history of agriculture. So when he did get to be an older man, he decided, you know, somebody should be collecting these kinds of things, and I'm going to do it. And so this one person took it upon himself to say to his friend, hey, I see you got this old hay wagon out back in your yard you're not using anymore. I'd like to start collecting those kind of things, because I have in mind that we should put together a farm museum. That was his idea. It wasn't an agriculture museum, it was a farm museum. That's what he had in mind. Farm implement museum, to be specific. He was very interested in the technology and the different machinery that was used. So he started collecting piece by piece haying equipment, equipment used for sugar beets, equipment used for lima beans, things that were equipment used for walnuts and apricots, all the crops that probably a lot of people in this room have never seen growing in this county. And you know, I'm more than half a century old, and I didn't see a lot of them grown myself, and I've been here my whole life. So he started collecting the equipment and just putting it in his barn, and then gradually he asked friends, could I put it in your barn? And it turns out that farmers don't tear down their own barns either. And they just let them stand there and they let him do that. So over the years, first he had 10 implements, then he had 20, then he had 50, then 100. You can see what happened. So then, I believe in the 1980s, he came to this museum and he said, I really think we should build more of a space to show this equipment. So the first thing they did is out in the back of this building, they put aside an outdoor space and they exhibited pieces of equipment with some signage about what it was used for and what crop, etc. That was the first thing they did. But Bob was determined, and he was a very determined man from what I've heard. I never met him, but I know his daughter very well, and I think she has the same kind of determination. And he kept collecting, and then he said, well, I know what we need to do. Oh, he formed a committee. Of course, what else do you do when you have a plan and you want to do something? You form a committee, right? You figure you're not the only one who thinks this is a good idea. So he asked his friends, and they said, sure, yeah, this is a good idea. We should preserve this history. So they formed a committee, and then they decided, well, what do we need to do? We need to raise money. So he sent out a fundraising letter saying what they were doing, and it said, we want to find a place, and we want to show this equipment, we want to preserve this history, and you can't do it unless we all work together. And I'm not sure exactly how many original donors there were, but it had to have been at least 50 families who sent in money based on this one letter. And that was his first chunk of, it might have been 100 families. He had quite a lot of success with his initial letter, and he got some money. So then he had a chunk of money to start with. And then it turned out that when people pass away, their friends could make a donation in their honor and say that they wanted it to go toward this farm implement fund and this future farm museum that they were going to have. And slowly, the money started to build. And in the meantime, Bob kept looking for a place, and this committee kept looking for a place. And then the museum staff, everybody was in on it. Everybody was looking for a place to have a farm museum. And believe me, they looked all over. They looked in Oxnard, they looked in Santa Paula, they looked all over, and nothing worked out. Over 2 decades of time that he was looking very hard for it. And it was very sad for Mr. Filer because he never got to see the Agriculture Museum. He died in 2002. And his daughter said he was quite sad because he felt very responsible. He had asked people for money, he had gotten money, and he hadn't been able to make it come to work out. And he felt like he'd let them down. Well, thankfully, there were other people interested in this idea, whether they be old farmers themselves, farm families, staff at the museum, members of the museum, docents, and Bob had children. And his daughter wanted to see, where's that money? Are we making sure that that's still there and we're going to use it? It's not just going to disappear into some other fund of the museum. Well, it did not. And so the search continued. And then, lo and behold, a miracle fell into our laps. That's what it seemed like. There was a big lima bean warehouse in Santa Paula. At least when it was built, it was a lima bean warehouse. This was 1887, 1888. 13,000 square foot building built along the side of the railroad tracks. Why? Because in those days, in 1887, people were growing a lot of lima beans. And the way you got them to your customers was to bring them to a big warehouse and then get them loaded onto a railroad car and have them shipped out to Los Angeles, San Francisco, to a ship to go across the other side of the country, etc. So there was this lima bean warehouse in Santa Paula. It wasn't the only one in the county. I believe there were 11 or 13 throughout the rest of the county. This was a common practice in the 1880s. Well, this building was used for a lima bean warehouse, and then farmers would bring other produce there to be shipped off by the railroad, apricots, and then they built a walnut warehouse next door. I mean, this was the center of commerce there in Santa Paula, but these kind of places were all around the county. Satacoy, Ventura, Oxnard, all would have had similar places at that time. So this building just stood there, and amazingly, it didn't burn down. I say that because a lot of these old wooden buildings, that's what happens. They burn down, they're old. Somehow, this one did not. In the 1950s, the Hanghold family, and that's a name you'd hear if you were a Santa Paulan, they came and bought the building and turned it into a feed store, because a lot of people around the area are raising animals. And so by then, walnut warehouses were not so necessary. Oh, excuse me, lima bean warehouses, excuse me. And so they had a feed store there. Oh, and it was called The Mill. And people always wonder, why was it called The Mill? Oh, was it a mill? And if you know what a mill is where they have big millstones and the water's moving the millstone, it's grinding wheat? No. You'd think it was a mill, but it was not. The reason it is called that, or was called that for so many years, was because the first company that built that building was called the Southern Pacific Milling Company. And it got shortened. People just called it the mill. I mean, who calls something by its whole name? So for years, it has been known as the mill for 100 years in Santa Paula. The Hanghold family owned it, and then by 2002, the Hanghold senior, the parents had died, and their children had been trying to sell antiques out of it, etc., and the business wasn't going very well. So the Hangholds were no longer involved. It became county property, and the Ventura County Transportation Commission was responsible for this warehouse because it's along a transportation corridor. And the very smart woman who was the executive director of the Ventura County Transportation Commission, whose name is Ginger Girardi, found she applied for a big grant to restore this building, because by this time it's one of the only lima bean warehouses in the county. It might be the only one at this time, which would have been 2008, something like that. So she got $2 million to restore this building, which was great because it was falling down, and it's a beautiful building, and there aren't, as I said, I think it was the only lima bean warehouse left, so it's historic. So she restored it and left the original floors and the original beams, but made sure they had a new roof because it was falling in, and etc. And then the grant stipulated that they would have to find a nonprofit group who was willing to run some kind of nonprofit agency inside that building. Along came the Museum of Ventura County and said, we're a nonprofit agency and we need a building and we need something for our agriculture museum, and this seems like a perfect match because this building was originally built for agriculture. So we applied, and Tim Schiffer, at that time our director, probably wrote information about what our plans were. And we had lots of plans because we've been working on this for decades about agriculture, and we've been doing lots of research, and we have lots of photographs in our historical library that are all about the history of Ventura County. Finally, we would have a building where we could show both the equipment and photographs, and we could tell the story of Ventura County agriculture. So we applied, and there was one other applicant. It was the Santa Paula Aviation Museum. And I've heard that the reason they didn't select their proposal is because they figured they couldn't get airplanes in the back door. I think that's true. So we were accepted as the new tenant. We pay $1 a year, which is pretty great rent. Our lease is $1 a year for 99 years. So the building was available. We then had to put in quite a bit of money to do some extra work to get it up to museum standards, because turns out when you have tractors and big implements and things of farming, they weigh a lot. They're not like artwork, they're like tractors, and they weigh many tons. And so we had to spend many hundreds of thousands of dollars to shore up the floor to make it sturdier than you would need for any other kind of business or nonprofit. So that floor has been shored up from underneath so that we can show these many-ton things. So we did that. We also put in air conditioning. We also put in excellent lighting, because when you have a museum, it's nice to be able to see what you're looking at. And it's really nice to have air conditioning, not just for people. I mean, that seems like a great idea, and I'm happy for that. But when you have artifacts, you have to take care of them. And if they get hot and then cold and then hot and then cold, that's really bad for artifacts. So if you have air conditioning, you can keep everything at an even temperature and humidity, and so that's perfect. So then we had a little bit of time to decide, okay, what are we going to do now? We have this 13,000 square foot building, it's empty. What do we do? So that's when I came in. There was a committee. There were people who'd been talking about it and trying to come up with plans, and when I came in, the plan was to just fill it with many, many tractors. Oh, this reminds me, we have a very important committee here at the museum called the Farm Implement Committee. They've been working with Bob Weiler for years, and then they continue to after his death, to talk about this museum and to talk about the implements, and some of them have been restoring some of the implements or keeping them clean and taking care of the collection that's all been stored in barns. And oh, did I mention by this time, anybody care to guess how many pieces we had by 2010 in the collection? Do I hear 200? Do I hear 500? Do I hear 800? No, more than 900. So we had a lot of pieces. So then the challenge is, okay, how do you show them? Which ones do you show, and how do you do it? And then Tim Schiffer, our current director at that time, and Robin Woodworth, our development director, began to talk to local county farmers and about what they envisioned in an agriculture museum. And all those people said, don't just put a bunch of old tractors in your museum, no one will come. So our challenge was to balance both showing a lot of implements, but not just showing implements, but showing stories of Ventura County history. So that was my challenge. And Kevin Genovese helped me do a lot of research, and docents had already done lots of research, and we decided that we should talk about the earliest agriculture in Ventura County. So there's a section about mission agriculture, because that was the period when the first organized agriculture was brought to Ventura County. We talk about the Chumash and how they worked with their environment to feed themselves, but it was not organized agriculture, so we try to explain that difference. And then we talk about the Spanish period and the Mexican period, and then the period when we became the United States and many more settlers started coming in the 1860s, and why is that, and 1870s, and then the first crops. So if you are to visit the Agriculture Museum today, you will see that in the first big gallery you come into, the Limonera Gallery, that talks about the earliest periods of agriculture in the county, and then includes the lima bean period and the sugar beet, grain. And so yes, you'll see a thresher, and yes, you'll see a sugar beet planter, and a big picture of the world's second biggest sugar beet factory in the world, which no longer exists. So you'll learn that Ventura County agriculture has been big and important for a long time, and these things, it's interesting to see them, and none of them are current today because agriculture changes, and we try to tell that story so people understand. It's not, I suppose if we had an agriculture museum in Illinois, for instance, we probably wouldn't have, or I know we wouldn't have, the number of crop changes, because they can only grow a few kinds of things, whereas out here, we could grow the same things they grow, but then over the decades, we gradually found that we could grow more things that they could not grow, and that's what made more sense to grow. And we try to explain that also, that farmers are looking for the most valuable crop. Why grow grain when you can grow strawberries? Because in Illinois, they can't grow strawberries all year round, and in Ventura County, we can. And so you make more money from your land, and our land is expensive, so that's what you gotta do. So as you can see, agriculture is a complicated and ever-changing industry, and we try to tell those stories. We also, in our visitor center, the first place you enter in the Agriculture Museum, we try to talk about the value of agriculture and how much is produced here, and that it's really a very large industry. Sometimes people don't realize that. The billions of dollars, $2 billion a year of crops that are raised here, and what that means. And the other thing we're hoping is that we know that lots of people tend to appreciate agriculture as being kind of pretty sometimes, from a distance. But then if you actually, what has happened in our county, we're living right next door. Urban and agriculture are right next door to each other. And that's not always an easy mix, because it turns out it's not just pretty. There's tractors, they're noisy. There's implements coming in and out of the fields, dragging dirt in and out of the field and mud. Sometimes they use pesticides. There's workers coming in and out in their cars. There's porta potties set up across the street from where you live if you're living. So agriculture isn't just pretty, it's an industry, and it has things going on. But if people want to not have just urban sprawl, they may need to learn to live in harmony with this kind of environment. As we know by reading the paper, we know that doesn't always happen. Sometimes people move in and then they suddenly notice that next door are big hoops of plastic. And then they complain, and you think, well, didn't you notice this when you move in? But apparently they didn't. So anyway, we're trying to help people learn about what agriculture is. It's not just a romantic idea. It's an industry, and it's very competitive. And in order to make money, they have to be really good at what they do and figure out the right crops to raise that are going to come to market at the right time. Because if they don't, that's when they just leave them in the field. Sometimes we wonder about that. You know, why aren't they picking the rest of those strawberries in the field? Well, they're not getting enough money to make it worth paying people to pick those. They'll just bring in the mower and mow them. That's what happens. It is so sad, but that's how it works. So we also at the museum carved out a few spaces in which we can have temporary exhibits, because we want to have many changes happen at the museum over a year. We want, every time someone comes back, every 3 months hopefully, they're going to see something different. So we have the Finch Family Gallery that's for that, and then we have some spotlight walls where we tend to show a lot of art. And that's been a surprise to people, I think, but I think it's been very positive, because when you think about visitors to a museum, not everyone's interested in the same thing, especially when you have a family coming in. Some member of the family is going to be really interested in tractors and just want to look at those tractors and marvel at how big they are and what the technology is, etc. Other members of that family are just going to cruise right by those tractors and look for anything else. So I know it's shocking, I need to say it. And so that's why we hang beautiful quilts, handmade quilts. They're related. I mean, people who lived on farms made quilts, and so this way we're trying to please all members of the family. We also show a lot of art, painting, sculpture, photographs, and they're usually about some kind of agriculture subject. I mean, we are an agriculture museum. I'm not going to go too far out there. There are art museums for that, but there's plenty of art that relates in some way to agriculture. So we've done that, and we also, the temporary exhibits allow us to focus more specifically on crops that maybe we just don't have room for. I mean, we have 12,000 square feet of display space. It's not enough room. We need twice that much room. We need to tell the stories, the number of stories there really are. I mean, there are so many stories about agriculture that you could tell. You could talk about transportation and how important it is and how it's changed over the 150 years we're talking about. You could talk about water. I mean, if you don't have water for your crops, you're out of luck. And that's always been the case. And we can tell some interesting stories about the struggles to get enough water. That's the big story right now. I'm preparing an exhibit to open in November, and it's about strawberries. And in May, a local water district announced that they were only going to be able to deliver 50% as much as they usually deliver in the fall, meaning this month, October. This is the month, I don't know if you've noticed, but they're all planting strawberries right now. Well, if you can't water them, they're not going to, that's not going to be good. And those farmers had already ordered all those strawberry plants, all those millions of strawberry plants. So water, extremely important. Contemporary exhibits, speaking of which, they're very interesting to do. We work with volunteer photographers, we go out and talk with farmers, we try to get artifacts, we try to get the contemporary stories. And then the other thing that I try to do is I plan a lot of events that go with the exhibits, because some people love exhibits and love looking at artifacts, and they'll read every label. That's 5% of people who come through the door, that's what they do. Another 20% will just cruise around and look. Another 70% are being dragged there. So we've got to try to engage them somehow. And one way we do that is by having special events. We bring in a speaker. We bring in someone who knows a lot about a subject or has a different perspective on a subject. So we've had farmers, and we've had historians, and we've had the daughter of a bracero, and we try to get a wide mix of people to give talks. And we have lectures, we have Thursday gallery talks, the second Thursday of every month, And that gets people in the habit of thinking, the museum is where you can go to get most interesting information on agriculture topics. So we do that. Then we have music nights on Friday nights, and that brings in people who just want to have a good time. It's inexpensive, and while they're there, they probably glance at the exhibits, and we're glad that they do. We have events for kids. First Sunday of every month from 1 to 3, we have free activities for children, and those have been a lot of fun. I mean, we've had things on produce, we've had baby farm animals, we've had mules. We'll try anything. Luckily, agriculture is very varied. I mean, you just have to think a little bit, and you think, well, you could do an exhibit called, or an event called From Lamb to Loom. Why not? Then you'd have the lambs, and you'd have the what's it called, shearing the sheep, and then you'd have the taking care of the wool, and then you'd have the weaving, and that's a legitimate agricultural pursuit, and everyone sees something hands-on and can try something. So, hey, we're going to do it this spring. We just have to make a few calls and find the people who have the sheep that they're willing to shear. And so if anybody knows anybody, please talk to me afterwards.
And then we'll get the knitters and crocheters out there to show us.
Yeah, the knitters and crocheters. So kids events, very important. And then I also want to mention, in the museum itself, we have a lot of hands-on activities for children. And parents thank us for this continually, because I don't know if you've ever been to a museum with a child, but they get bored after about 10 minutes, if not 5. And just looking at an artwork and hearing you tell them about it, gosh, surprise, surprise, they really don't like it. I speak from experience. Whereas if you have a place where clearly there are things they can touch, we have try-on clothes, we have a tractor you can climb on, and this is not a toy tractor, this is a real tractor. That was one of the first decisions I made. I said, we're going to be showing all these shiny, beautiful tractors, and kids are going to walk around, and they can't touch them, and they can't climb on them. I don't think they're going to be very happy. So, okay, we get a real tractor, and we got a volunteer who built beautiful stairs and a surround railing so the kids would be safe. And the kids climb up there, and they can play with a clutch, and they can play with a steering wheel. They can press a button and hear the sounds of a tractor. It's our most popular exhibit. So all those exhibits, I spend weeks trying to write the right copy and do the research. Forget it. It's the tractor that the kids can ride on. So that's very popular. We've got an actual buggy and a horse. The horse is not real. You probably do that. But the buggy is real. We love that. And we have puzzles, and we have lots of, every exhibit I ever make has question and answer quizzes throughout the exhibit. So the kids have something to do, and also it gives parents some way of interacting. Or I hear as many adults going through reading the question and trying to think of what the answer is as I do kids. So it just makes it more interesting rather than, we're the experts and we're telling you everything. This is a way for them to participate, so I think it's a lot more fun. We also have a beehive. That's very popular, although I have sad news. We all know it was windy lately. Apparently, the wind really hurt the bees. Isn't that interesting? The population went way down. I haven't done any research to find out if that's common or why that is. They had been doing so well. When we first opened the museum, our friend Bruce Freeman went out with a beekeeper, Bill Weiner, and got a colony of bees. And we have this big, rather large, transparent beehive, and they were invited in. And they have stayed there ever since and done extremely well and multiplied and made lots of, honey. You can harvest the honey. You take it apart and you smoke them so they calm down, just like you've seen pictures of perhaps. We do that right outside our back door about every 8 months. You don't do it in the wintertime because you need to leave the honey in for the bees, but you do it when there's plenty, and actually it's getting so crowded in there you have to make room. It's just going crazy, but apparently the wind, not a friend of the bees. So I'm trying to think if there's anything else I wanted to tell you today, anything else that was on that PowerPoint, but I'll show it another time. I think those are kind of the highlights of what we're doing. We also are going to be changing the main exhibits in the 2 main halls that you see, Limonaire Hall and Calavo Hall, so that you'll see new things in there at least once a year. So the idea is people will come back and not say, oh, I've already seen this before, but oh, these are new things, and I like coming here. That's